and I am a first-year MESC on the BIOMES committee. And just to introduce BIOMES, this is our weekly flagship seminar. So you can find us here every Wednesday at noon. We bring in a really wide array of people, so remember to have it on your calendar permanently. And also remember that if you ever want to submit a speaker to come in for this slot, please let us know, because we want to have them student-sponsored. But today I have the honor of introducing Phil Barnett, and he has worked on Capitol Hill for 25 years and was the staff director for both the Energy Commerce Committee and the Oversight and Government Reform Committee in the House of Representatives. He has helped enact the Clean Air Act as well as other major legislation, and he has extensive experience in congressional oversight and led major investigations into the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, contract abuses in Iraq, and the Wall Street collapse, and many other notable issues. He got his bachelor's degree at Princeton and his law degree at Harvard. So please join me in welcoming him to Yale FES.
Thanks, Andy. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. It's really nice to be here. Number one, because my daughter Eve is a second year, and I'm so proud of her. And if I ever get any chance to be with her, I just jump at it. So I'm really thankful. As Andy's really nice introduction said, I've worked in environmental policy for a long time, and I know from that. This is the second reason I'm really happy to be here, how important FES is, or maybe now it's SOE. It's SOE. But constantly I run into people who are graduates here. I've had a couple that have worked on our staff who've just been phenomenal, work on other staffs, work in really important places in DC and across the country in environmental policy. So I know I'm talking to future leaders, and so it's a real honor to be here. This is my second. Evie had me come up previously. I know some of you were here when I talked in the fall. And then I sort of looked backwards. I talked about the Clean Air Act of 1990. And that's when I first started out. I had the good fortune to work for 25 years for Congressman Henry Waxman, who was one of the real environmental champions in Congress. And I started out, the first thing I really jumped into was that law. And then I jumped forward 20 years when I was staff director on the Energy and Commerce Committee and talked about trying to pass comprehensive climate legislation, the Waxman-Markey bill. And we got it through the House in 2009, but it didn't pass the Senate. I thought what I would do in this talk is not look back, but look forward and talk about how do we make progress on climate change. And I have a perspective that maybe you've heard before, but maybe you haven't, because I want to talk about what we can do if we are innovative and creative with the Clean Air Act. And my view is there's a lot more authority in the Clean Air Act to deal with climate change than people ordinarily understand. And so that's going to be my focus. When people ask me what would be the best way to deal with climate, number one, the best possible way would be for Congress to act and to do something that's effective, that gets us on a 2-degree or 1.5-degree pathway, and does it with bipartisan support. And I had the good fortune to work on a lot of different kinds of legislation, and almost all of it was bipartisan. The Clean Air Act of 1990 is a great example. That was a very strong law, over 400 votes in the House. I worked on the Food Quality Protection Act, which is the law that set health-based standards for pesticide residues on foods. Very, very bipartisan. I think it was unanimous when it passed the Senate. The legislation in 2009 giving FDA jurisdiction over the tobacco industry, which was really important advance in public health. Same thing. Laws on telecommunications, procurement policy, always the way to do it was to try to get bipartisan support. I only worked on one big law that didn't have bipartisan support, which was the Affordable Care Act. And the Affordable Care Act has done really important things for millions of people. So it's been great, but it's been constantly under siege. So I know, and all of you know, because it's an obvious point, if Congress could pass something that's comprehensive, effective, and bipartisan, that'd be the best possible way. It would give the agencies a directive. It would unify the country around climate change. But I also don't think we can count on it. I know people are, and always look for optimism, and I'm glad to see there are glimmerings now on the Republicans in Congress talking about planting trees, supporting R&D for climate, which is terrific. But I compare that to 12 years ago when we tried to do the Waxman-Markey bill, or the year before, 2008, because we tried it in 2009. John McCain was the Republican nominee. His platform wasn't planting trees. His platform was a cap-and-trade program with a 50% reduction in emissions by 2050. And there was a coalition of industry CEOs and environmental CEOs in a group called US CAP that was advocating for climate action. So when we launched on trying to pass climate legislation, Waxman-Markey, in 2009, we thought we would be able to get that kind of bipartisan support, and that the stars were potentially aligned. It didn't turn out that way because, with a very few exceptions, the Republicans decided they didn't want President Obama to have an accomplishment, and they were going to, even though it was part of their platform, that basic concept, they were going to try to tear apart, call it carbon tax, and fight. So I'm hopeful things will be different. I know things are different in 2020 than in 2008. There's all this energy of the Green New Deal and activism, which is great. We know even better about climate dangers, but we can't count on it. Even if we elect a Democratic president, the Republicans could take the same approach, no accomplishments, and try to tear down progress. So we need a plan B, and that's what I was going to talk about today, which is how do we use the Clean Air Act. And I want to focus specifically on the provision that's called the International Air Pollution Provision, Section 115 of the Clean Air Act. How many people have heard of that section of the Clean Air Act? Great, just a couple of people. Evie says she's heard of it. Good. It's titled the International Air Pollution Provision. So it's a logical place to look. And what we'll do is spend the next half hour or so talking about it and then have questions. I first started to work on the look at this section in 2013. Congressman Waxman tried really hard to pass Waxman-Markey and failed. The next Congress, we actually tried to work on a carbon tax. Do you all remember there was a moment when there was this talk about a grand bargain between President Obama and Speaker John Boehner to deal with our long-term fiscal problems? Well, like lots of discussions in Congress, there were lots of ideas for how to cut taxes and how to increase spending programs as part of this grand bargain, and very few ideas about where to raise the money. So we thought, well, maybe a carbon tax could play that role. In the end, there never was a grand bargain. So the next Congress, Congressman Waxman started with Senator Whitehouse a bicameral task force. And Congressman Waxman had the view, if we're going to really make progress, we have to do it with existing authorities. So we asked the staff to scrub existing law. And we looked at EPA authorities and FERC authorities and Department of Energy and Ag and Interior authorities, and we talked to a wider range of people. And the one that jumped out to us more than any others was Section 115. There was a great group of law professors from the climate law centers at Columbia, NYU, and UCLA who did a lot of legal analysis, and they wrote a paper, about a 90-page analysis in 2016 that I just put up in case people want to know more, or interested and want to know more. A couple of professors here from Yale were part of that as reviewers. Dan Esty and Doug Kaiser were reviewers on the paper. Section 115 is a very short section. It's 500 words, and I'm going to show some slides about what the words. And here'd be a question or a challenge. When I think about it, if I had to write a law in less than 500 words that would give comprehensive authority to EPA to do what needed to be done with climate, I think it would be very hard to come up with something that was better or better designed or constructed than this provision. There are two requirements for action in Section 115, two triggers. The first is endangerment, and that'll probably be familiar to you. We have to find that emissions in the U.S. contribute to air pollution that cause or contribute to endangerment of health or welfare, not in the U.S. but a foreign country. There are a number of endangerment clauses in the Clean Air Act. The motor vehicle section 202 that authorizes the regulation of motor vehicles has an endangerment clause when the Obama administration, the first litigation, Mass versus EPA, that said EPA can regulate greenhouse gases, was litigating the endangerment clause, which is very similar in section 202. And then when the Obama administration promulgated greenhouse gas regulations, doing that in conjunction with CARB, they were using that authority. So first you have to find that our emissions are endangering other countries. Given everything we know, that's straightforward. The second requirement is reciprocity. And if this provision says that the U.S. is going to act to reduce our emissions, other countries have to act too. And that's an important provision because it means we have to be part of a global effort. And if we're going to shoulder a burden, we also have to receive benefits from other countries acting. And as we'll get into later, it's an important constraint on how far and what the executive branch could do with Section 115, which is important for judicial review purposes. Okay, what happens next, on the next slide, which is really the brilliance of Section 115, is if you find endangerment and if you find reciprocity, which now after Paris there's a sound predicate for finding, that was the analysis of the law professors, then what EPA does is it has to require states to modify their state implementation plans, their SIPs, to prevent or eliminate the endangerment. Who knows what a SIP is, a state implementation plan under the Clean Air Act? There should be more hands about that. That's the heart of the Clean Air Act. When you hear about the Clean Air Act has been able to reduce emissions by 70%, while our economy's quadrupled in size, this phenomenal cutting of emissions while we have growth, so much that has been done through the state implementation plans, which in their way they're most familiar is EPA sets an air quality standard, national ambient air quality standards, and states have to do SIPs to achieve it. And the way 115 works is that if they find endangerment and reciprocity, EPA gets to tell states to reduce their emissions to address that endangerment. So that's why it can be so concise, because it picks up on that really well-established mechanism, which is state implementation plans. There are several advantages about operating through state SIPs. Number one, they have a broad scope. When EPA sets an ambient air quality standard for ozone or for particulate matter, and states have to develop plans to meet them, states have to deal with all the sources in the state and control all the sources that are necessary to meet the standards. So it's not sector by sector regulation. Second, when you're in the SIP universe, there's express authority, it's the underlined phrase, there's express authority to use market-based mechanisms. And those could be emission fees, carbon taxes, or those could be allowance systems. And when we're thinking about a problem like climate and how to deal with something with many sources, having that express authority is really important. We put that into the law in the 1990 amendments. And a really interesting just sort of war story from that time, some of the most conservative members of Congress were defending the ability to put in those fees both here and if the other advantage of this program is if the states don't act with the SIP, the federal government can come in with called a FIP, a federal implementation plan. And there was an effort by the Ways and Means Committee to strip out this market-based authority. And some of the most conservative members in Congress voted to keep it in for EPA because they were on the Energy and Commerce Committee and they wanted it jurisdictionally when we did it. So that's the basic structure of how Section 115 operates. There are 4 reasons why I think it's really a attractive for dealing with climate. First, it's target-based. Everything else in the Clean Air Act that we would use, and we should use a variety of mechanisms, it's not that you pick what the goal is and then you tell industry or states to meet the goal. Instead, you can do a technology-based standard for reducing emissions from cars. That's based on the technology. Same thing if you're acting under Section 111, like they did in the Clean Power Plan, you look at what's the best system of emission reductions. So it's technology-based. Section 115, though, can start with a goal. What do we need to prevent or eliminate the endangerment? And that syncs up, harmonizes with the International Paris process perfectly. If we have a new administration and they want to re-enter Paris and they want to set a 2030 target, Section 115 can be linked to that target and be a way to achieve that target. And when 5 years later we have another pledge for 2035, you can use it again as a ratchet mechanism to ratchet down. Second, I've already mentioned, you can use market-based mechanisms. Third, which I already mentioned too, which is multi-sector. And that is really important when you just think about the administrative burden. There are dozens of sources you have to regulate to deal with climate. Power plants are obvious, vehicles are obvious, but you've got oil refineries and steel mills and pulp and paper and chemical plants and on and on. If you're going to use, if this is a situation where Plan A should be Congress legislates, but if Congress can't legislate and we have to use administrative authority, if we want to do this sector by sector, you have to do a separate regulation for each. In fact, to use Section 111, you have to do two. You have to do one for new sources and one for existing sources. And then the states have to come up with a plan. And you have to do that over and over again. Some of those, and we can get into this, may make sense to do. But with Section 115, you can set the overall target, and you don't need to do sector by sector. And then the last, which I think is really important in where we are now, is it accommodates existing programs really well. There's a problem, we faced it when we were working on Waxman-Markey, but then state programs like California's hadn't even officially launched. There was RGGI, I think was in place, but it was, but now we have so much state leadership and we have different programs. If you start thinking about federal programs, they can dislodge all that work. Section 115 doesn't work like that. It's like an umbrella over them. Or you could think of it like an anchor man in a relay race. Everyone else has gone as far as they're going to go. You got to get across the finish line. Section 115 takes you across the finish line. EPA sets a target for a state. A state can take credit for everything that's going on in the state. It doesn't get dislodged, but it just says you have to do an extra increment at the end. So, and there's no other provision in the Clean Air Act or, as far as I'm aware, existing law that has all of these attributes. And so that's why when I think about it, I think it's such a promising option. Let me turn quickly just to implementation, how do you actually use it. And there's a lot of work going on in implementation. Those law professors, they were going to write a book about Section 115, which was going to be timed to come out shortly after Secretary Clinton was elected as president. And it was going to do a much deeper dive. They pulled back because Section 115 was under some assault from Republicans in Congress, but they've now revived their efforts, and it's meant to do a really deep sort of policy dive. I'll touch on a couple of the issues, but not all of them. For full disclosure, I'm an author on one of the chapters and a co-author on a second chapter in that effort. And there's modeling work going on at MIT. A big challenge when you use this provision is what should the national target be and how do you allocate it to states? And MIT is trying to do that sort of modeling work. I thought I would just talk about these three things. One, how do you set the national emission reduction target? How many people are lawyers or in law school in this room? Just a couple. Okay, so let me see if I can. Pardon me, go back here. Oops. Okay, this is a statutory language. Require the SIP to be revised with respect to so much of the applicable implementation plan as is inadequate to prevent or eliminate the endangerment. That's like just such classic congressional language. Because you know what that means. It's just common sense. It's, you're causing an emission problem, causing air pollution problem in another country, you should prevent or eliminate it. But if you're EPA and you're trying to think, well, what does that actually mean? And how do you, there's just all kinds of questions that come up. These aren't unique to climate. Even if you thought of like the paradigmatic case of a facility, a chemical plant on one side of the US border, and it's causing toxic emissions on the other side of the border. And maybe there's no safe limit for the toxic emissions. What level does the US plant have to reduce? How long does it have to do it? Does the other country have to do anything? There are all these questions. Lots of them revolve around that key phrase, what is prevent or eliminate endangerment? So there's been a lot of thought gone into this, and I thought I would just take a few minutes and do a little bit deeper dive. This is probably the only place I do a little bit deeper dive on how EPA could deal with it. And the contention that we have, this is my working on it with the law professors, there's lots of options for how to interpret this in a way that reasonably bounds EPA's discretion, which is important for judicial review, but still lets it be an effective mechanism to put us on the pathway for 2 degree or 1.5 degree of warming. The first thing EPA could do is consider that keyword endangerment. The agency's made past endangerment findings. And when it makes past endangerment findings for climate, like for motor vehicles, it's done it recently for airlines, or did it at the end, towards the end of Obama administration for airlines, airplane emissions. It's found endangerment both currently and at the future. So it's saying you already have endangerment. And that's an option that I'll talk about how you go forward if EPA took that approach, which it might well. But EPA doesn't have to take that approach. The role of endangerment is very different in 115 than in other provisions. In the other provisions, you find endangerment, it's a trigger for regulation, but the regulation has no connection to endangerment. The regulation is do what's technologically feasible to reduce emissions. In 115, the regulation is supposed to address the endangerment. The language is very similar for EPA in section 115 for how EPA finds endangerment. Let's go back 2 more. Whenever the administrator they said there's a, whoops. Whenever the administrator, that's the same. But if you look at the end, there's also language that says the Secretary of State can allege endangerment. That's unique to section 115. One way to read that is it's an authority for the Secretary to ask EPA to set endangerment at a certain level. And so that authority could be used by a new Secretary of State to say, well, there's a global effort to keep warming well at 1.5 or well below 2 degrees. I'd like you, EPA, to find endangerment at that level. And that's easy for EPA to do because there's clearly endangerment at that level. If you find endangerment at that level, section 115 becomes very clear. How do you set the national standard? Well, you can take into account what other countries are doing. If you have agricultural programs or others you don't want to address through 115, you can take those into account. And then you say, well, what do you have to do with 115 to put us on that pathway? It would function very similar to a national ambient air quality standard in providing guidance for the states. This is a target you want to get to. So that's one thing that the agency could do. Let's suppose they decide not to do that. They want to do the traditional found endangerment right now. So you have to prevent or eliminate endangerment that's happening. How could you do that under the statute? EPA could focus on the word prevent. Prevent usually means, people often think of it as stop from happening. Well, it's impossible to stop from happening climate change that's dangerous if it's already happening. But prevent can also mean to hinder or impede. And you can definitely hinder the endangerment that's happening. So that's a second avenue. Maybe the agency says, well, I don't want to do that. That's too broad a grant of authority. I want to stick to traditional endangerment, and I want to stick to stringent reading of prevent, that you have to stop it from happening. EPA's still got several options. Reciprocity becomes really key here. You can't act under 115 unless there's reciprocity with other countries. Well, there's reciprocity if we are on a 2-degree trajectory, because other countries are trying to be on that, taking into account their differing national circumstances and others. There might be reciprocity at 1.5 degree, but there's not reciprocity if we said we're going to try to keep the world at 1 degree. So the agency could look at reciprocity and say that's a bound on what we can do. We've got to prevent or eliminate, but we can't go farther than we're allowed to under the statute. And there's yet a third or final option for the agency. I think it's on this page, which is the cause or contribute language. Endangerment is if you can cause endangerment or contribute. When you contribute to endangerment, you can't possibly eliminate it because you're just making a contribution to it. All you can do is eliminate your contribution. And that might sound kind of extreme to say 115 requires the U.S. to eliminate its contribution to endangerment. But actually in the climate context, it's not. All the Democratic presidential candidates and pretty much every scientist is saying we need to be at net zero by 2050. When we're at net zero, we've eliminated our contribution. There's no time deadline in 115. So the agency could interpret that as eliminating the contribution at 30 years. That may sound like a lot, but in the visibility provisions of the Clean Air Act that protect visibility in national parks, has a similar, it's different language, but a similar thing where the states are supposed to get rid of the visibility impairment. EPA gave them 60 years to get there, twice as long. So these are all questions for the agency to figure out. But the point is, there are in this language, which is kind of common sense language, lots of ways to read it that give the agency the tools it needs to do, but also have, only one, the definition of prevent might be open to being fairly broad. All the rest constrain it in ways. Okay, so let me jump back to where I was. Apportioning emission reductions among the states. As the next step. This is one where there's a lot of good precedent for how to do this. The provision in the Clean Air Act that's most like Section 115 is the good neighbor provision. Is that people have familiarity with that? This is I see some nods. This is a provision that applies domestically. 115 applies internationally. We can't do emissions that hurt other countries. The good neighbor provision says upwind states, like in the Midwest, can't have emissions that interfere with meeting air quality standards in downwind states like in the East Coast. And the EPA has done 3 separate rulemakings: the NOx SIP call in the 1990s, the CARE Clean Air Interstate Rule in the 2000s, and the cross-state pollution rule in the 2010s that have each successively had very significant reductions, and they've all been, there's litigation about them all, litigation on a specific point about how do you allocate the emission reductions among states, but they've all ultimately been really successful. In 2014, the Supreme Court weighed in on how do you allocate emission reductions from upwind states. They have to do an aggregate number. How do you allocate? And the Supreme Court said the agency has lots of discretion because the statute's silent on it. It can do it on a cost base, so try to equalizing marginal costs, which is what EPA chose. It could do it on proportional emission reductions, or it could even do per capita. So there's good precedent for the agency to be able to address inevitable equities among states. The other thing that they did in the interstate rules, which is the final point, which was really helpful, when you're in a SIP and you have said, here's the target for a state, here's what you have to do, the state can do whatever it wants. And that's good from our cooperative federalism standpoint. But states also in complicated programs can benefit from guidance. And what EPA pioneered in these interstate rules, the good neighbor provision, was model state plans. And each one was a market-based plan, cap and trade plan. And in each case, every state after litigation was through adopted the model plan. And so they've been very successful in reducing emissions. And EPA could do the same thing with 115. They could do a cap and trade program, which would work great with what California is doing, with what the RGGI states, what states like Oregon are trying to do. If they wanted to do a tax-based one, they could put out a tax-based. They could put out multiple model plans that make it easy for the state to know what they need to do. So that's implementation issues. I had one final thing that I wanted to just talk about and then open it up for questions, which is the legislative history, because it's just fascinating on this provision. I want to show you a quote. Air pollution is no longer confined to isolated places. This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. Who said that? Anybody know who said that and when? It's President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 in his message to Congress asking them to strengthen the Clean Air Act. That's important because Section 115 was in that 1965 Clean Air Act when President Johnson called on Congress to act. Let me show you another quote. The increase in carbon dioxide in the air tends to raise the air temperature and may in time melt the polar ice caps. This melting would in turn greatly raise the level of the oceans, thus dangerously shrinking the Earth's land surface area. Who do you think said that? It was William Green, who you wouldn't know, a former congressman, in testimony before the Energy and Commerce Committee on the bill that has Section 115 in it. And just one final one, I could go on, but this is, man is unwittingly conducting a vast geophysical experiment. By the year 2000, the increase in atmospheric CO2 will be sufficient to produce measurable and perhaps marked changes in climate. That was the President's Science Advisory Committee in the report on restoring the quality of the environment in 1965. In one way, this is really depressing to show you those quotes because that's 55 years ago. There were several chapters on the environment in this report. The two that got attention were motor vehicles, and if you go back to the clippings, and the climate one. So we've known for a long time. But for Section 115, it's great. Section 115 has changed over the years. It changed in 1977. Initially, if you found endangerment and you found reciprocity, you did an abatement conference. You called the U.S. states involved and the foreign countries. You tried to talk it through, and ultimately the Attorney General could bring a lawsuit. That's exactly how the good neighbor provision worked at that time, which was in the law at 63 through an abatement conference. In 1970, Congress said, when they did what we think of as the Modern Clean Air Act, they said the abatement conference does not work. And so for the good neighbor, for the interstate provisions, they abandoned it and said, let's do it through SIPs. In 1977, they said that's a good idea to do for international too, 115. So they made the international provisions also operate through SIPs. But the core language, endangerment and reciprocity, are unchanged from then. And so when people say, well, you couldn't possibly use this provision 55 years ago, no one even knew about climate change, it's just not true. So I thought that might be a good place for me to stop. I'd be happy in questions to talk about this more. There are lots of questions I get asked. Well, how come, if it's so good, how come I haven't heard of it? Would this have a chance to stand up in courts? How would this relate to efforts to regulate power plant emissions? Would this interfere with legislative action? And be happy to answer all of those. I'm also happy to talk about experiences on Waxman-Markey or anything else. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. So I was wondering about non-attainment areas and portions of states where there's particularly bad air quality and those exceedingly urban centers where there's a lot of industry coming out of one central place. I was wondering, how do those specific areas that are maybe responsible for more of the air pollution issue, how do they necessarily fit into thinking of how to use Section 115?
Well, some of those areas states that have, California's got a lot of those areas. For California, 115 is great because they're moving on climate. And when we worked on the Clean Air Act in 1990, one of the real challenges, one of the real issues, a lot of states were really good allies, because if they're acting, there's some competitive disadvantage if other states aren't acting. So for states that are acting, that have really polluted areas, which California would fall in that category, a state like New York too, a 115 is terrific because they're going to be acting on climate anyway, and this brings other states along. There will be, And this debate shows up so many times in trying to do climate clean air legislation between clean states and dirty states. When we did the acid rain provisions in the 1990 amendments, there were states that already had reduced their acid rain emissions, put on scrubbers or done other things. And there were states that hadn't. And we had a national cap on emissions. We allocated it to power plants in the states. Well, the states that had a lot of emissions wanted to be, they had to get a 40% reduction. They wanted every state to have to get a 40% reduction. But the states that had already acted said, well, we can't get another 40% reduction because we've already acted. That's unfair. Let's do it based on cost or something else. So you'll have a lot of considerations like that. That's why that case I talked about, the Homer City case, that said EPA has some discretion to pick ways to allocate, is so important because it gives a chance to try to figure out pathways to balance the equities. And that's some of the modeling that we're trying to do at MIT, is to figure out, well, if you did it based on certain approaches, who gets hit, what are the impacts, and what are sensible ways to do it.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I was wondering about the reciprocity clause.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like it was meant more for bilateral transboundary pollution than something global. And what's specifically the legal meaning would be behind essentially the same rights? Because if I were a Republican governor, I would be arguing that China and India aren't granting American citizens essentially the same right if they're postponing their emissions reductions.
Yep. That's a great question. So why don't I hop back up? We put the reciprocity provision on there. Essentially the same rights, respect to prevention or control of air pollution. This provision made a ton of sense in 1965. Because in 1965, there was an abatement conference. And it said that foreign countries had a right to participate in the discussion. And so it was basically a procedural. If you found endangerment and you want to convene an abatement conference, you had a right to participate, which is really a procedural right. They left this completely untouched when they changed the enforcement mechanism. And let's see if we have, I think I took it out. The only right, the next sentence in there says the foreign government has a right to participate in the state hearings on as they change their SIPs. So if you read it, what's the right that's in Section 115? It's actually a procedural right to participate. The Paris Agreement is loaded with procedural rights for countries. As you put forward your submission, it goes through these, it used to be a bifurcated process, one for developed countries and one for developing countries. Now it's a unified process for other countries to get to critique, ask questions about it. There's technical peer review evaluation. There's lots of points of input. There's also the opportunity to enter into bilateral agreements to strengthen those. So if you're looking at essentially the same rights, what's the right in there? What it started out as procedural. That's sort of what you speak of as rights. There is a procedural right that's pretty minor, and you could pin it on that right. It would make sense for an administration trying to use this, though, to do both procedural and substantive reciprocity. And when you look at the legislative history on Section 115, it was so that if there was a slide that said we're enacting Section 115 to deal with climate change, if there was a quote, I would have shown you that. So I don't want to overstate it. There was a lot of discussion about climate, but there wasn't a specific linkage there. But what there was lots of discussion is we need a mechanism so that if there's an international air pollution, we can engage with other countries and follow it up with action. And the reciprocity clause was added so that there'd be reciprocal benefit. So that if we're acting, our citizens will benefit from the actions of other countries, which speaks to substantive reciprocity. And that's a term that ultimately courts will have to give some deference to the agency because there's so many ways to look at substantive reciprocity. If you said, okay, a natural way, well, let's all cut by 50% from some baseline. That's one way to look at it. But you could also look at it as per capita emissions. And our per capita emissions, I think Australia's are higher, but we're next. And so other countries are way below us. Or you could look at historical responsibility, or you could look at just what can you afford and effects on GDP. And in that realm, that's why reciprocity is an important requirement, is agencies can figure out, well, what is a reciprocal? The reciprocity provision literally requires only one other country. That wouldn't make sense for EPA to do it with one other country. They should do it with a whole bunch of countries and try to make that and try to make that finding. In the legislative history, there's lots of discussion about nations. There's also discussions about Canada and Mexico. So it supports both doing it broadly and doing it narrowly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. My question is around the applicability of Section 115 to the Administrative Procedures Act.
Yep.
And to what degree, say, a future Secretary of State asks the EPA to calculate endangerment, what does that indicate with the APA?
The APA is a great question because there was an effort to use Section 115. One of your professors is Dave Hawkins at NRDC, and he was the assistant administrator for air in the end of the Carter years. Carter administration. Acid rain was a really big problem. And so as the Carter administration was going out the door, they, first Dave went over to Canada and said, if you would pass a law that looks something like Section 115, we could trigger Section 115 and then we'd have to reduce our SO2 emissions. And Canada did that in December of 1980. The elections were in November, so this is way out. So in January, the next month, the EPA wrote a letter to the Secretary of State and said, we found endangerment. Our sulfur dioxide emissions are causing endangerment of acid rain in Canada, and reciprocity, because you said you'll act to protect us. And then went out the door. And the Reagan administration came in and didn't do anything. And so they were sued. And it went to the DC Circuit. Then Judge Scalia, who was later the Supreme Court Justice, wrote the opinion, and he said, the APA applies to this. There was no notice, there was no public comment, there was nothing, there was just a letter, and so threw it out on procedural grounds. So the APA would apply. In the specific thing, if the Secretary of State asked for endangerment finding, one way to do it would be that EPA would then do a big record. They have a request from the Secretary of State to establish endangerment at 2 degrees. And then they would go through lots of science and say, yes, at 2 degrees you're finding endangerment, and that would be subject to review under the APA. Great. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm just wondering why there has to be a separate endangerment finding from the one that they already found after Mass versus EPA.
The Mass versus EPA is almost exactly the same, but it's endangerment in the U.S. And so this would be separate, but it's a lot easier to find international for 3 reasons. Number one, endangerment in the vehicles was just vehicle emissions. And they found vehicle emissions cause endangerment. This is all U.S. emissions, so it's bigger emissions. Second, the science has advanced a lot, so it's just clearer. And third, other nations are more vulnerable than the U.S. are. And so you've got, in every way, it was not a difficult finding to make, but it would have to be made just to satisfy the foreign endangerment piece.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions on that, or anything else? I really appreciate the chance to be here. I hope if you want to take away one thing about this, one, be engaged in the election. It matters a lot. But the other is, because I think it can be depressing about climate change, there really is an avenue in the Clean Air Act to do the kinds of things that we need to do. And so if we have a president that cares about climate and wants to do it, it will take 8 years. You can't do this in 4 years. The Obama administration sort of showed that when they tried to do the Clean Power Plan. If Secretary Clinton had won, it would all be fine. It would have been carried forward. It wouldn't have been reversed. But there is a pathway, and that's one of the reasons that I'm so excited about this, because I think when you look out there and you think about Congress and it's so dysfunctional, and how do we do things, and how do we stitch this state and that other state, really we need federal leadership. And it turns out that the Clean Air Act has a provision that back in '65, when people were talking about climate, is really well suited for that. The Energy and Commerce Committee just introduced a climate legislation, put out their discussion draft, and it was pretty interesting. It's the first bill that's done this. They don't do, for their enforcement mechanism for how to do it, they do clean energy standards, they do energy efficiency, they do buildings, they do lots of things. It's their R&D. But they don't do, it's not a carbon tax, it's not a cap and trade. They created their own program for states to say EPA will tell states that they have to get to net zero by 2050 and do it through a SIP-like mechanism. And here in the existing, you have that exact mechanism here in the existing law. Great, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. Hi. Yeah. Yeah. I think they're doing great work. I was thought someone might ask me how does this relate to legislation, because I think that if there was a that it's so helpful in legislation to have some fund that have the expected strong administrative action, because it says to Congress, you should act now. If you don't act, it's terminated leaving the station with this or whatever. It provides a context. Section 150 states, if they wanted to, could do cap and dividend. Yes, the northern states actually would. So that under this, they would have a target if they wanted to use a cap and dividend approach. They can do it. The difference between that and federal legislation is with federal legislation, the Congress gets to decide what to do with the money. If you do it administratively, they don't get to do it. So for them, if this is in the dynamic and in the bloodstream there, it's a motivator. Some people have said who want like have tried to say, well, we should demonize this provision, and we should make it seem so fearsome that it really, Congress has to act. I think that's a big mistake because we might have to use it. Congress might not act. So you don't want to do it. You don't want to make it so scary. Is that? But it is a motivator. Oh, hi. Oh, yeah. Sure, be delighted to. To me, it's good for progress that way. But that's through. Yeah. We're still getting impacts, right? On air quality, with stuff being downwind. Yeah. Well, and it's also the outside. It would absolutely be a chance, and it would take time. We're not so call. All of them would, but they all ended up producing. That was what I was facing. You had to deal with the actual problem. Thank you so much for all the support you've given my product.
I just want to say thank you again. Yeah, thank you. That was really great.
First things first.
I've done my really good friend. How's it going? Sarah. Nice to meet you. Thank you very much for giving the talk. This is all new for me, so now I know a lot. Great for you. Yeah. This is great.
I'm actually pretty into everyone sitting here.
Yeah, especially at
I've never
that
heard the same one.
I was like, I was engaged. It was good. Yeah. so glad that things are.
socialization and things is being made, let's just put it out. We're still trying to figure out socialization